All right, my friends, Stout-Hearted 7, chapter 17. Now, this is kind of a hard chapter because this is where they talk about the massacre. Remember at the end of chapter 16, Marianne was screaming, "The Indians are killing Father and John." This next chapter talks about it. This is real life, my friends. This really happened. These were events that really took place at the Whitman Mission, and hopefully this summer or next year, you can visit there, or I'm going to try to go and do a video, and so people can see the places that that happened, where these things happened. So, chapter 17, part 1. This is going to be a 2-part chapter because it's long. The terrible day that Father had long feared but not actually expected had begun. Catherine sat stunned, one stocking half on. She saw that Mother too looked dazed. All the color left her cheeks. She walked up and down the room, wringing her hands and moaning, "My husband is killed and I am left a widow." Then she noticed Elizabeth still sitting in the tub of water. "Get dry and put your clothes on, child." As if moving in a dream, Elizabeth obeyed. Women from the mansion house began pouring in at the side door, all out of breath and white with terror. Mother recovered from her first shock and asked one of them to help her carry Father in from the kitchen. He was still breathing, and she bent over him, trying to staunch the blood pouring from the tomahawk wound in his head. "Can you hear me, Marcus?" His eyelids moved, and his lips formed the word, "Yes." "Can I do anything for you?" "No." He closed his eyes. Mother clasped him in her arms, as if hoping somehow to bring him back. Then she laid him down gently and pulled herself to her feet. Catherine noticed how her face had changed. Fear was gone. She lifted her head as if she were looking into the face of God, saying, "Lord, I am ready." "Oh, Mother," Catherine thought, "how brave and wonderful you are, how much I love you." But there was no time to tell her. Mr. Rogers and one of the immigrants, Mr. Kimball, rushed in. Mr. Rogers was holding one arm. Mr. Kimball had a wound in his back. Mother came back to earth when she saw that both were bleeding. "Oh, that Joe Louis! He is the one who started this! Our Indians never would have done it except for him." Hoping to find out more of what was happening outside, she stepped briskly to the window. Just as a bullet pierced the glass, shattering her shoulder. For a moment she was stunned, then rallied to order. "We all must go upstairs." The other women rushed to help her. Mr. Rogers and Mr. Kimball started up after them, but Catherine cried out, "Don't leave the sick children behind." Mr. Rogers scooped up Louise in his one good arm. Mr. Kimball managed to carry Helen and Henrietta. Upstairs, they lay the three on the bed beside Mother. For a while, all was quiet. The frightened women and children had begun to hope the Indians had gone away when they heard steps below. A voice they recognized as that of Tamsuski, one of the chiefs, called that he was their friend and had come to help them. He offered safe conduct to the mansion house, saying that the Indians were going to burn this one. "I don't trust him," Mr. Rogers said, but Mother differed. "God has raised up a helper. I am willing to go if someone carries me. I am too weak to walk." When she saw it was Joe Louis who came up to help carry her, she hesitated, but it was too late. He lifted her onto a cot and took one end, Mr. Rogers the other. They started down the stairs, the women following. Catherine, Elizabeth, and Mary Ann stayed behind to comfort the 3 sick children, who alternately moaned and screamed. Mr. Kimball had rolled into a dark corner and did not move. Catherine listened to the slow descent of the little progression down the stairs and through the sitting room where Father's body lay. She knew when they reached the kitchen. Then came the sounds of crashing furniture and dishes, yells, shots, and one awful cry from Mother. Catherine covered her face with her hands. Elizabeth crept close and whispered, "They killed her." Gradually, the sound died away, followed by a silence that was even worse. Too terrified to move, the 3 girls sat on the floor beside the bed where the sick ones lay. Every moment, Catherine expected to see Joe Louis return, but the minutes and hours passed without another sound from below. Mary Ann went to sleep on the floor, but Catherine and Elizabeth sat close together, so frozen by fear that they could not even get up to see whether the sick ones were covered. Once Elizabeth whispered, "John is dead. I wonder about Frank and Matilda. Maybe dead too. Maybe we are the only ones left alive." Catherine put her arms around Elizabeth. "Mother was so brave. We must be brave too." "I don't feel brave." "Neither do I." Mr. Kimball across the room had stopped moaning, and the awful stillness was broken only by the snarl of cats fighting in the ravaged room below and the striking of Mother's wall clock. As the hours dragged by, Elizabeth found the clock striking unendurable. She hid her face in Catherine's lap and stuffed her fingers into her ears, but could not keep out that sound. Bong, bong. 2 o'clock. Hours, days seemed to pass. Bong, bong, bong. 3 o'clock. Only 3? Eternities dragged by. Bong, 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 bong. Elizabeth groaned. "I can't stand it." She turned away from her sister and sank into a fitful sleep. Catherine drew up her knees, folded her hands, and rested her head on them. Over and over in her mind went the events of the last few hours like a nightmare. If only she might wake up and find that it had never happened. She wished night would last forever, or that the roof would fall in on them. Anything to keep the Indians away. When morning came, the sick children cried for water until Mr. Kimball could stand it no longer. He struggled up from the floor, wrapped a blanket around himself, and walked slowly down the stairs. The crackle of a gun out in the yard told Catherine the water would never come. After a while, she heard steps ascending the stairs. Joe Louis and several Indians came in. You are not going to be hurt," Louis said to the trembling girls. "Get your things together." Catherine gathered up a few clothes and her 2 precious books, the family doctor book and Mama's Bible. But she also could not carry them, and one of her little sisters too. The Indians told her they would bring her things later. She carried Louise, and Elizabeth picked up Henrietta, but when Mary Ann tried to lift Helen, she could not, and they had to leave her there, screaming. "We'll come back for you," Catherine promised. Somehow they managed to get down the stairs, through those dreadful rooms, and along the familiar path to the mansion house. Some of the women met them, took their burdens, and let them inside. Laying Louise on a bed, Catherine sat down exhausted, but only until she had gotten her breath. Then, accompanied by 2 women, they went back for Helen. This time, when she reached the mansion house, she saw Matilda there with Eliza Spaulding. They all fell into one another's arms. "Where's Frank?" Catherine added. Matilda burst into sobs, so Eliza had to tell the story. At the first sound of gunfire, Judge Saunders, the teacher, rushed to the schoolroom door only to be shot down. Frank, the oldest boy in the room, decided the children should take refuge in the loft, and they piled books on a chair until they could reach the trap door opening. One by one, he boosted the children through it, then followed them. We must pray, he had said. Never, Eliza told Catherine, had she heard such a wonderful prayer as Frank poured out. Soon they heard Joe Louis calling from below that they should come down. You won't be hurt, he promised. All but Frank went down into the yard where the Indians lined them up against the side of the house and discussed whether or not to shoot them. One of the older men said no, there had been enough killing. After a while, Matilda was comforted to see Frank coming toward her. He took her hand and stood beside her, whispering, I couldn't stay in the loft not knowing whether you had been killed. Joe Louis saw Frank, grabbed him by the shirt, and pulled him out of line. You bad boy, he said, and shot him through the head. Women whose children had been in the schoolroom rushed to take them to the mansion house. Matilda and Eliza were left alone, too frightened to move or speak. All they could do was wait, hand in hand. How long they stood there, freezing, they did not know. Finally, the man who had protested against any more killing came back, took them by the hand, and led them to the mansion house, where kind Mrs. Saunders, in spite of her own grief, drew them into her room, warmed them, and gave them something to eat. Now began a month of terror for the women and children, and the 3 men who had been spared to help the Indians. First of all, they took the 2 Manson boys and David Mullen to Fort Walla Walla, saying they were part Indian, so they were not to be hurt. For some unexplained reason, they did not feel the same about Marianne and Helen Marr, though Helen was too ill to have gone, even if they had suggested it. She and Louise Sager, both unconscious part of the time, lay in one bed. Catherine sat beside them, giving them water and trying to soothe them. Louise moaned constantly, John, I want Brother John. Henrietta, however, was now able to be dressed, so Mrs. Saunders got up her courage to speak to one of the chiefs about the Sager children's clothing. All he brought them was 1 ragged blanket apiece and a few bits of Mrs. Whitman's underclothing, and someone had to lend them clothes after all. Joseph Stanfield, one of the men left alive, was detailed to dig a grave for the victims, whose bodies still lay where they had fallen. Father Broletti, a new Catholic priest, came over from Umatilla to assist in this grim duty of giving the dead ones a decent burial. Trembling, Catherine held Henrietta, with Elizabeth and Matilda clinging to her sides, while the bodies, wrapped in sheets, were lowered into a long grave. Father and Mother lay at the end, then John and Frank and the other 10 who had died. None of the sisters cried. They could not believe those sheeted forms were really their parents and brothers. Only after the earth had been mounded over them did it come to Catherine that she was now the head of her family. As John had become a man the day their mother died, she now became a woman. Life was so strange, she thought. If John had not been so kind to Mother, if he had gone to Le Puy with the pack train, he would be alive today. And if Frank had not come home that time he ran away, he too would still be living. Why was it that when one tried to do right, such terrible things happened? 2 days later, Louise died. Then Helen Marr, and an immigrant child. The three were buried near the great mound, not far from Alice Whitman's grave, and Catherine felt comforted by the thought that Louise was with John. All right, my friends, this is a sobering chapter. This is about the Whitman massacre. A massacre is when many people die, and this happened at the Whitman Mission in Walla Walla. So now Catherine is the head of her family with just some sisters left. So we are going to read the rest of chapter 17 tomorrow. All right, my friends.